So you have a Next-Auth app and want to migrate to Clerk. Good decision, by the way. This migration from Next-Auth to Clerk can be really daunting. It usually entails downtime and a massive migration process. At Clerk, I've been working to mitigate the overhead of this entire migration. During this migration, there are a few major concerns, such as how do we do this process without downtime while respecting the rate limit of 20 requests every 10 seconds? Well, in this guide, I will walk you through the entire process. So here's the migration guide. I put the link of the repo below. So of course, you're gonna need an active Clerk account and you're gonna need your current Next-Auth application as well as access to your user database. Now we're gonna get into the first part of the migration. The first thing you wanna do, of course, is install Clerk. And we also need another package called p-retry. All the p-retry package does is import a function that allows us to do exponential backoff with promises. So like when the promise fails, it'll implement the exponential backoff to retry. The next thing we want to do is add Clerk middleware. So with Clerk middleware, what we want to do is make it the top level wrapper, and within the Clerk middleware, we can put the actual Next-Auth middleware and all your custom functions. After that, we want to wrap the entire application with the Clerk provider. This allows us to use all of Clerk's custom components. Specifically, we use useSign-in within the Trickle wrapper. I'll explain more later. The next step in this process is to import the folder auth migration. This contains all the components that we're going to use during this migration. So the first thing we're going to implement is something we define as the Trickle migration. This allows users who are currently signed in to stay signed in, as well as get created in Clerk and get signed in through the Clerk process. What this does is that when you shift your entire auth flow from Next-Auth to Clerk, users will not feel the change in auth nor have to sign in again. Now the Trickle wrapper calls a specific endpoint called auth-migration. All you need to do is create this endpoint in your /API folder. We actually set up the entire endpoint for you. We just need two functions from you. We need one function, which is the old auth function. What this does is allow you to use Next-Auth's auth function as well as Clerk's auth function within your application. Now, since Next-Auth allows you to bring your own database adapter, we're not able to implement a done-for-you solution for every database adapter. So what we need from you is to use your specific database adapter and to give us the ID, the email, and the password. With these functions, we're able to use them to create the API route that the Trickle wrapper calls in order to actually sign your user in. I'll go through the details later in the video. Now that we have the trickling implemented, what we have to do is migrate your data access patterns. What this means is wherever you call the auth function or use Next-Auth specific functions to access auth data, instead of using Next-Auth's, we'll use Clerk stuff. Specifically like the auth function. That's one example. We can use current user, we can use the backend API, all of that. And we'll run through some examples right now. So the first thing we want to do is set up the sessions claim so that our special user ID returns either the external ID or the Clerk user ID. So if you're using an external table to reference their metadata, you can use only one key, which is either the Next-Auth key or for new users, the Clerk ID key, to access their information. In the Clerk dashboard portal, you want to go to sessions claims and input this specific line of JSON right here so that when we actually call the session claims, it'll either return the external ID if it's present, if not, the Clerk user ID. So right now we're actually patching the actual Clerk auth function to change the user ID that the Clerk function returns to the sessions claims that we set. This is only useful if you're using an external table that you own to reference user metadata. Here's an example of using the auth patch as well as the session claim in order to reference only one key within your database. So here we see us using the auth patch. And then when we're calling your database, you see here we're referencing the ID alone and using the user ID. And with the auth patch, we've set user ID to sessions claims.user ID, which up here is either the external ID if present or the Clerk ID. I know that's really confusing, so if you have any questions, drop it down below in the comments. So now there's zero downtime with this migration. One specific concern is if a user wants to change their profile information during this migration process. So I mentioned how we were using an exponential backup function for promises. This is because if you have a lot of users, we have to stick to the 20 requests every 10 seconds. The actual Trickle wrapper has the ability to fail and retry. So let's just say you have 10,000 users coming at once. You can only go at the speed of 20 requests every 10 seconds. So let's just say we have periods of time. We're at the first period of time. A user is backed up in the trickle and he has to be trickled in at the third unit of time. What do we do when that user who's not in Clerk yet wants to edit their password? What we do is we check if they're in Clerk. If they're in Clerk, we edit their user profile information, such as their password, within Clerk. If they're not in Clerk, that means they're in Next-Auth and they haven't been trickled over yet. In that case, we edit their information in Next-Auth. Therefore, once the trickle actually hits them, their information will be moved over to Clerk. You can own your user metadata table within your own database, but Clerk has a really cool feature within their user objects where you can store the actual user metadata table. And the pros to that is that we don't need to worry about Next-Auth keys. So how to use the Clerk metadata table is wherever we call create user, such as either in the batch or the trickle, we can actually use these fields: public metadata, private metadata, and unsafe metadata. You can refer to the Clerk docs to what each of them does, but this is how to use them. So as you can see, we're storing special metadata within the user object, and this is how you'd reference them. It's pretty cool, really simple, really easy to use. Now, the trickle handled all the users that are on your application. What about the users that are not on your application, such as a user who is either logged out or hasn't visited your application during the migration process? For that, we have the second step, which is the batch import step. All this does is take every user from your database and import them into Clerk. The reason these two processes are separate is because we want to respect the rate limit of 20 requests every 10 seconds. Once the thundering herd of all 10,000 users getting trickled in at once is over, we recommend to start the batch import. So what we do is we store your entire user information into a queue, and then we pop them at the rate of the rate limit into Clerk. In this implementation, I'm using Next.js's server components as well as Upstash in order to store all your users in a queue. But you can use any process that fits your needs in order to do this part of the migration. This is just a sample. So as you can see here, we're pushing all of their information into a queue. Once all the users are stored inside a queue, what we can do now is have a cron job runner call a backend API point and pop them off at the rate limit of 20 requests per 10 seconds, or however fast that you want to pop them off at. Again, I'm using Next.js's route handlers. You can use whatever backend you'd like, and as well as I'm using Upstash's cron job runner. You can use whatever cron job runner. We also recommend ingest. And then here, we pop them off at the rate of either the length of the queue, because if you're popping off a small amount of users, we don't want to overdo it, or the max limit of 20. And in the cron job runner, we set the job to call every 10 seconds, but you can set it to anything specific to your needs. So after all your users are done migrating into Clerk, what you can do now is use Clerk sign-in and sign-up components. Since your users are already signed in to Clerk, once you switch the actual authentication part, it'll be a seamless transition. Now let's dive into the code. So I explained how there was a trickle wrapper that we wrap our app around, right? We put that into a template.js file. This is the code for it right here. So what we do is that we call this auth migration endpoint. In the backend, we number one, try to create the user. If it fails and they already exist, we get their information, we get their ID. If they don't exist, we create them and get their ID. With that ID, we create a sign-in token. That sign-in token is what gets returned to this auth function. As I said, p-retry was an exponential backup functions for promises. So if it fails, right here, if the response is not okay, so if it fails, it'll just try again and it'll just keep on going. If you're either one, not signed into Next-Auth, or two, already existing Clerk, you'll return a response of 222, and all it does is set the token to none. This is not a good practice. I will definitely clean it up, but it's just to get the V1 out there. So once we get that token, we use signin.create to actually create the sign-in, and to sign them in, we pass it to the setActive function, which actually signs the user in. So we make the API point, and all we need you to do is create some helper functions. Those helper functions are right here, the has session, which is just the old auth, and the get user data, which is the actual ID, email, and password. Right now we only do plain text passwords, but I'm going to be able to make it so that you can submit like a hash and everything. We try to create the user here. If it fails, we just get the ID. Here, we generate the sign-in token with this endpoint, and then we just return to the client and sign them in. So yeah, that's what the wrapper does. The other code in here is just like the batch functions, which you saw in the docs, and the ways to access either user metadata or using your own user metadata table that you own yourself in your database. Here's an example of the Trickle in action. So here we have pleasework@gmail.com. And you can see in my dashboard, pleasework@gmail.com doesn't exist yet. So if we log in Next-Auth here, we can see it working. And then it creates the user in Clerk and signs them in. You can tell because the user button works when you're signed in. So we can look here and have a refresh and have pleasework@gmail.com working, and he's successfully been migrated through the Trickle. It's really rough right now. There's a lot of edge cases that this doesn't cover, but let me know what y'all think. If y'all end up using it, put it down in the comments below. And if you guys want to help like submit PRs or submit issues, just go to the repo link and have at it. So that's what I've been working on for the past 2.5 weeks. If I know I've been talking about it throughout this entire week, like, oh, I'm behind schedule, which I am behind schedule. So after this part, there'll be the vlog for the catch up for the previous weeks.